Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're live. This is another Cirucci Team Brief, May 10th, 2019. We got George and Johnny here this afternoon, and we're just going to be discussing some of our latest research. Just right before we went live, George brought up some great information about Tim Horton, the famous Canadian hockey player who the chain Tim Hortons is subsequently named after. Tim Hortons is probably, in terms of amount of restaurants per capita in a city in Canada, Tim Hortons probably has the most chains or most restaurants in Canada. They're everywhere, in particularly the Northeast too. But George, if you want to go into that, you're mentioning the educational background of Tim Horton.
Well, this is okay. This is something more abstract because I've never actually seen a Tim Horton because I live in Northern California. I guess they haven't made their way here yet, but give them time. Well, Tim Horton lived from 1930 to 1974, and he is probably best known for uh, his tenure with the Toronto Maple Leafs. But he did play for some American teams like the Pittsburgh Penguins and so forth. Well, I guess as Eric was saying, Tim Horton is a popular restaurant chain, mostly in Canada. There are some in the United States. Anyhow, Horton went to St. Michael's Catholic School in Toronto. And of course, he, like Eric, was actually born. Well, I mean, Horton was actually born in St. Catharines, Ontario. So it's just like one other example of how if you have some sort of at least tenuous nexus with Rome, that's a good plug for your career. And not only good for your career, but it helps you become an icon to where you almost obtain immortality.
Oh, wait.
Just
You don't mean like George? You don't mean like people like John Ronald Reuel Tolkien or Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, do you?
or Babe Ruth or Vince Lombardi or uh,
They actually define their genres, don't they?
or John. Well, or you could say very
William
modern.
Shakespeare.
I'm sorry.
William Shakespeare, who may have been Francis Bacon, who may have been Sir Toby Matthew.
Yeah,
Yes, and
great
of
point.
course,
Actually, I have a biography of Toby Matthew. It was I put it on archive.org, so you guys can read it for free.
Snatch it up, brother. Great
It was
job.
yeah,
Great
I'll
job.
send it to you. But I know the author mentioned the possibility in that book of Bacon being Shakespeare and Matthew knowing about it, and so it's very intriguing to say the least. And Matthew was
Not
officially
only
known.
that, I grabbed it from you. When you put it up, I grabbed it from you. And the subheading of that book, which is written by like Arnold Matthew, I think is his descendant, is Bacon's alter ego. Toby Matthew, Francis Bacon's alter ego. So basically, he's claiming credit for anything that Francis Bacon did, which is to either be secretly William Shakespeare or to have edited the vaunted authorized King James Bible. And by the way, Toby Matthew was knighted by Protestant King James I for almost granting his son Charles a wedding with Catholic Infanta of Spain. I forget her name.
No, you're spot on. It's fascinating, and Matthew. I think it's covered in the book that he translated all of Bacon's like essays into Spanish. So he's intimately familiar with Bacon's literature, and with the King James. Oh, I think Johnny got booted out there. He'll probably come back in. And with the King James Bible, I don't know if you've seen this, George, but I think it's damning evidence. There's Manly Hall reprinted these photos, but he shows certain headpieces that were present on the King James 1611 Bible, and he compares them to the headpieces on the cover of Sir Francis Bacon's book Novum Organum, which is known as one of his more classic philosophic works. But like they're identical headpieces, and I'm sure that there's a Psalm 42 actually has a hint of there's a reference to Shakespeare. Even in the Psalm, you can look that up. Type in Psalm 42 Shakespeare. So it's very intriguing. But like you're right, George. Like Johnny as well. Being Catholic or connected, to the Vatican will help your career. Um, if you're starting, a chain or like a philanthropy work type of thing. I'm pretty sure. Let me see here. I want to say the founder of Chick-fil-A was a devout Catholic as well. That's just another one I can think of
And
here.
I just heard
Was it
on the radio.
Samuel Truett Cathy? I'm pretty sure this guy was. Let me just confirm this here. Pretty sure this guy was devout Catholic as well. Actually, no, this guy was a Southern Baptist. I'm thinking of a different example. Yeah, this guy was a Southern Baptist from the Chick-fil-A.
Okay, but that necessarily doesn't mean anything because Bill Clinton was supposed to be a Southern Baptist. Al Gore, Jimmy Carter, fill in the blank. For a while, was it Newt Gingrich was supposed to have been a Southern Baptist, but anyhow, so we're talking about having a Catholic background, rather being practicing or education, whatever. This is something we're discussing. You're talking about the royal couple, Harry and his wife, Meghan, or whatever it is, Meghan Merkel. Even though she was of a Protestant background, she went to a Catholic school.
Wait. Didn't Daddy hit the lottery in order to bring her to a special Catholic school?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. What a stroke.
Yeah. So.
But she's Protestant. She went to a good little Catholic girl convent and learned how to be a good, chaste little Catholic girl.
And the ceremony was clearly a Protestant ceremony in the fact that they were honoring the Jesuit priest Pierre de Chardin, like the father of the New Age movement. They're calling him like a great theologian.
You bet. And I'm sure that black Anglican bishop from Chicago had nothing to do with the Jesuits stirring racial strife on social justice there in Chicago. That's something the Jesuits have nothing. As a matter of fact, I'm sure the Jesuits had nothing to do with Saul Alinsky and all the other far left movers, Jew or black, there in Chicago, because boy, they don't have any history there in Chicago. Chicago is the farthest thing from a Jesuit Catholic town as you can imagine.
Okay. You mentioned Saul Alinsky. I brought this up before, but he was mentored by Tom Godet, who was French Canadian from Massachusetts, and Godet got his undergrad degree from Boston College. Also, during don't recall the exact days for Godet because I have some other windows open. In the 1950s, he worked for Admiral Radio in Chicago. They were instrumental. They were the distribution company for the television broadcast for Fulton Sheen, and they also broadcast the American football games from Notre Dame. So, as I said, later on, Godet met Saul Alinsky and mentored him. And in the early 1970s, Alinsky allegedly wrote the rules for radicals.
Good for you.
So,
did you know if Saul Alinsky was tied in at all to the Rockefeller Foundation at all? I found recently that you're mentioning social justice. A big social justice warrior, the Reverend Teddy Hesburgh, was actually made
That's
the
right.
chairman.
Yeah. Good for you. Teddy Hesburgh was president of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah, that was 1977, and he was like a lifelong member before becoming like the full-on chairman.
Was that before or after he went to the South Pole, or before or after he was gifted a ride in an SR-71, or all the other amazing things that the brilliant Father Teddy Hesburgh did? Another reason why I think Eric John Phelps is an incognito priest. He just loves Teddy Hesburgh.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that angle about Phelps. And Hesburgh, he was also with Frank M. Folsom. He was like the representative to from the United States to the International Nuclear Energy Commission or the Atomic Energy Commission. And
wait a
there's
minute.
photos. There's photos in Hesburgh's autobiography that you can see on Google Books with him and with Frank Folsom. Frank Folsom, the Bohemian Club member, head of RCA for over 20 years, was also assistant to Donald Nelson. He was a, quote, assistant to Donald Nelson when he was chairing the War Production Board, which I think...
Are you saying that Father Theodore Hesburgh held multiple official positions in the United States government? What about the separation of church and state? I frequently talk to, can I dare call him my friend, our professor, our resident professor, Walter Veit, and I bust his chops for continuing to say that the problem is that we don't have true separation of church and state. We have separation of church and state, and it was founded by Romans so that when you have a vacuum, the great harlot who has all the power can suck herself into the vacuum. To the point where we have actual Catholic priests serving in roles, being appointed or advancing. How many times have we heard? I came across the person that the one that prosecuted Jeffrey Dahmer was an ordained Catholic priest, and his defense attorney, who did such a bang up job, was trained by the Jesuits at Marquette. And doesn't Saucy say that he was prosecuted for tax evasion by an ordained Jesuit priest?
Yeah, he does. And, just another great example of that was the Whitey Bulger case. His brother, Whitey Bulger, was like the FBI agent who was running he was responsible for many murders in the Boston area. But I found his brother, William Bulger, went to Jesuit Boston College Prep, Boston College, and got his doctorate from Jesuit Boston College. And then refused to testify during the whole Whitey Bulger incident. And that case, really went nowhere. I haven't looked at the prosecutor, attorney side, but the fact that, his brother was connected to 3 separate Jesuit institutions, to me, just, shows that they were probably involved in that whole racket, because Bulger himself was a gang member and an FBI agent. He was working as an agent for the Catholic FBI while being a gang member at the same time.
That's unusual, Eric, because the Federal Bureau of Criminal Investigation is usually really good at stopping crime. Not.
Yeah, well, they did a great job after the Kennedy assassination by sending the car up to the Knight of Malta, Lee Iacocchi's Chrysler plant for the evidence to be completely disassembled. And I just want to mention just quick, that was part of the master plan of the Jesuits in coming to America. And interestingly, someone made a post on my Jesuit World Order blog on John Adams' quotes, speaking on the Jesuits. But John Adams actually acknowledged that, if we allow the Jesuits to come in here, it's going to be a legacy of despotism, darkness, and death. But he acknowledges, though, that given the free liberty, given the nature of the U.S. Constitution, we can't ban or disallow.
Yeah, because the Constitution was written by Jesuits, of course. And this is the same Adams that died with Jefferson, not the same year, but on the 4th of July, which likely means they were murdered by Jesuits to make their little statement on the 4th of July. And it's the same John Adams that helped financially found a Catholic church in Massachusetts, I believe it was.
Oh, great information! I found information that Thomas Jefferson regularly spoke in Catholic churches. In a video I did on Washington, I found the source on Google Books. And to give credence to the Jesuits murdering those two, in the book History Composing Georgetown College from the founding time to 1889. This was around 1850. The Jesuits at Georgetown had a celebration to honor both Adams and Jefferson, which I think was very telling. And we were mentioning earlier with Francis Bacon, there was a Jesuit that was quoted in that book that acknowledged, he was giving a speech at Georgetown, and he acknowledged that Shakespeare was quote probably Francis Bacon. But there's lots of interesting.
Do you see the redundancy, Eric? Do you see the redundancy of it? So you've got William Shakespeare, who didn't exist, and if you dig any deeper, you might find Francis Bacon, and you still have to dig deeper still in order to get to Toby Matthew.
Absolutely.
John
Toby
was
Matthew's
great.
been basically like white. I remember he was mentioned in a book I have that Manly P. Hall wrote, and Manly P. Hall didn't mention that Toby Matthew was a Jesuit, that he donated all of his possessions to the order, and like he was made a Jesuit by Cardinal Bellarmine. Like, Manly Hall didn't mention that, for instance. So like,
Vatipedia. User edited Vatipedia. I changed it from Lickmypedia to Vatipedia. That doesn't say anything about him being a Jesuit either. Meanwhile, it's very clear that he converted to Roman Catholicism. And I'll tell you something else. I've come across his daddy, who was well placed, Tobias Matthew, who supposedly was just this inquisitional persecutor of poor innocent Catholics. And meanwhile, who was it? It was what famous Jesuit there that was an insurgent traitor and was executed for being a traitor?
Campion.
Edward
Good for
Campion.
you. Brilliant, both of you, brilliant. Edward Campion. So Edward Campion called Tobias Matthew out for being an insincere Protestant. Said, I heard him say he doesn't believe in what he talks about. And Matthew just shot back how much he was wrong and how much he hated his guts. And it occurred to me that someone who persecutes, really goes hard after Catholics is kind of the same way that maybe Steven Anderson goes after homosexuals. Might be a little bit of homosexual action going on himself and some self-loathing there. So he's got to prove himself to the Protestants of England. I mean, what a shock. I mean, out of the blue, his own son travels to Rome and converts to Roman Catholicism and then becomes a Jesuit priest. I'm sure that wasn't out of the blue.
No, I think you're on something there, but I think to the father's credit, I think there was a letter reprinted. If I remember correctly, in the book where he said that he said like he was incredibly disappointed in his son, and he said his son is now serving the poor of Babylon.
They warned him. They warned mommy and daddy. Warned him, don't go to Italy. It'll just destroy you. It'll cloud your mind. It'll make you go papist, and that's exactly what happened. So I don't know. I'm very cynical. I'm probably too cynical on this, but it's just a little odd. I mean, another one that comes to mind are the Dulleses. How does it you have good Protestant Dulleses and boom, out of the blue, you get Avery, the son of John Foster, who becomes not just a Catholic, but a freaking Jesuit priest.
And a future cardinal.
One of the most powerful in the West.
I believe he was one of Donald Trump's professors, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And yeah, Avery Dulles is never talked about in terms of Operation Paperclip. Like the two Dulles brothers are talked about, but the Jesuit Avery Dulles is almost never mentioned in print. I just noticed that. Like he's been.
Are you saying the president of the United States is Jesuit educated? What the heck? That's weird.
Like, many if you go down like just recently. This is just outright open Jesuit education. You had Trump went to Fordham, Clinton went to Georgetown, Johnson went to Georgetown. But that's three of the last 6 or 7 presidents have been just openly Jesuit educated. Let alone like the overwhelming ways that they control the other ways they control the president.
Excuse me, fellas, could I just throw in a couple of things? I was telling Johnny this yesterday. We were talking about Bill Clinton. Yes, people talk about the fact that he got his undergrad degree at Georgetown. However, most people don't know that he went to a Catholic primary school, St. John's in Little Rock. So the whore got their tentacles into him early on, no pun intended. So just, I realize Clinton has been out of office for almost 20 years, but just as a recap, in addition to going to Georgetown for his undergrad degree, in addition to going to a Catholic school, in addition to being part of Jacques de Molay, a high-level Freemason, he was also allegedly a couple of sources, Eric John Phelps and James from Japan, he's a Papal Knight of Malta. So if Clinton is in fact part of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, that would make his wife Hillary a Dame of Malta. So I just thought I'd share couple of fun facts.
That's a great find, George. I didn't even know that myself, and I have repeatedly researched Slick Willie Clinton. And then when you and I were talking about that, we also started talking about Barry Soetoro, and his time there at a Franciscan school in Indonesia when he had his transgender nanny taking care of him. I'm sure that didn't do anything for his sexual identity. It didn't help him very much.
Actually, I know my mom recently bought Michelle Obama's recent memoirs, and she told me how, like, my mom's not plugged into this stuff at all. Like, but she told me how Michelle Obama wrote about how she went to a Catholic school, which I kind of chuckled after she said that.
Wow.
But and, you know, I just want to mention with Bill Clinton, like, he was a disastrous president. Like, in terms of just like on the top of my head, like, he signed the Telecommunications Act in 1996, which, you know, massively deprivatized, or essentially it allowed the U.S. press to come into its current concentrated state, where there's 6 companies controlling like all media in the United States. Like Bill Clinton, the prison population under Clinton like increased like 30%. Like the wars in Yugoslavia, he gave like up to date like Western U.S. Technology to the Chinese. Like he gave the Chinese like all of the U.S.
Supercomputers. Supercomputers. He gave the communist Chinese supercomputers, and so it was becoming blatantly obvious to everyone around that he was a high traitor. And so, in order to create a smokescreen, you bring him up on so-called on trial for something stupid that serves the counter purpose of being licentious as well. So it gets people all frothed up and lusted up, and you get the a-hole football fans. That's no big deal. So he got is to something. He got a Bravo Juliet under the desk. That's no big deal. Meanwhile, it's just nothing more than a show, a dog and pony show, which he wasn't even found guilty of, which he did, and in reality, it was nothing more than a smokescreen for sickening high treason.
Oh, and his lawyer was as much of a Jesuit lawyer as you could get. Robert Bennett went to Jesuit Brooklyn Prep, where he was a valedictorian. Then he went to like Holy Cross and Georgetown. At Georgetown, he was a member of the Philademic Society. And Robert Bennett has like a long career of representing deep state clients. Like I think he represented a few of Oliver North's associates during the Iran conflict.
Hey, wait, back. This is bringing up my conservatard days. Doesn't Robert Bennett have a conservatard, devout Roman Catholic brother who was like education secretary or something like that? Big in, I think it was a Reagan administration. Go ahead, George.
William or Bill Bennett.
Bill Bennett, yes. You've got Bennett, you've got dueling Bennett, you've got a hard left lawyer, ambulance chaser taking care of the left, and you've got a phony conservatard on the right, and both are in the same family, devout Roman Catholics. That's really weird to see that, isn't it?
Boy, that sounds like a pop song from the early 1970s. What was it? Forgive me for being facetious. Clowns on the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Catchy. I think that's very powerful evidence on how the Vatican plays both sides of the dialectic. Just with those two Bennett brothers, very powerful example.
Yeah, no different than George Gordon Battle Liddy and his good buddy Timothy Francis Leary, both devout Roman Catholics, both playing games on either side of the political spectrum.
Oh man! After Liddy did his treasonous act, they went around college campuses and did I want to say 10 or 15 debates across the country.
Yeah, and they went out and had beers afterwards. They're good pals, good buds.
And actually, recently, I saw this on your website, John, about Liddy's son. I don't know if he I assume he.
Yeah, little Peter. He also went to Fordham just like Daddy. A Jesuit-educated pedo. That's really, wow.
Yeah, that's very intriguing to say the least. And yeah, there's been accusations that I forget the Air Force guy's name that I sent you guys the source, but Liddy has been accused of being one of the shooters in the Kennedy assassination. So that shows the high treason, and he refused.
George is dying to jump in. George is dying to jump in, but I've seen an accusation that he was the one that murdered J.D. Tippit.
Well, I've
yes,
seen that accusation as well. Yep, that's yeah. So like it just shows like the treason. Like and like with Watergate, like he refused to testify, like an unprecedented, like arrogant thing to do, and like he wasn't, like he wasn't questioned like really at all on why he's refusing to testify, and like he was released. He was pardoned by the Trilateral Commission, Jimmy Carter, after like 4 years of like serving or something like that.
George, what are you trying to say?
Well, okay. We're talking about this earlier. You're talking about the Kennedy assassinations. Well, the judge who heard Barbara Sirhan's case, and of course, I have no idea why Sirhan's parents hated him so much as to name him Sirhan, but that's besides the point. Well, the judge who heard his case was William Byrne, who is a professor at Loyola Marymount. Now, more recently, Sirhan has had several.
He was a professor. Holy cow! Jeez, that shows how that's a controlled trial for sure. Wow.
Okay, so Sirhan has had several lawyers over the last half century or so, but his current one is William Francis Pepper, who got his undergrad degree from Boston College.
Francis.
So, and of course, we're talking at the beginning of the show, or actually before the show, about how if you just have some sort of loose affiliation with Rome, that at minimum will help your career, if not, make you a superstar. Another example of that is I told Johnny about this on the phone yesterday, is there's a series on HBO called Game of Thrones. I believe is off the air or just gone off the air. It's been on for seasons. I'm really not familiar. It's basically supernatural dragons and queens and sorcery, things like that, murder, mayhem, incest, rape, good wholesome family fun. Well, anyhow, the creator of the novels on which it's based is George Martin, not to be confused with Sir George Martin, but we can talk about him again in a moment. Sir George Martin was the producer of the Beatles back in the 1960s. He worked with other bands like Bad Company and Paul McCartney and Wings. But and of course, he was trained by the Jesuits. He went to Stonyhurst or one of those schools in one of those SJ schools in England. Anyhow, this George Martin, the American, was born in 1948. His George Richard Raymond Martin. So it goes by G.R.R. Martin, and he's been considered to be the American Tolkien, because Tolkien and C.S. Lewis both had big influences on him. Now, this Martin is nominally of a Jewish background, but he went to a Marist school in New Jersey, which is Catholic. They're an offshoot of the Christian Brothers. Now, I mentioned Marist schools before. I brought this up on the show a couple times with Eric. There was a radio and TV personality with CBS named John Daly, who lived from 1914 to 1991. Daly was born in South Africa because his dad was an American geologist there. Anyhow, John Daly went to a Marist high school in Johannesburg, and when he moved to the state,
George, I don't think it's fair for you to point out a prominent Jew who is Catholic educated, because really you need to look at the whole and see how many Catholics have been Jewish educated, and then the big picture comes out at how the Jews really control things. I mean, how many prominent Catholics have been Jewish educated, and how many prominent Jews have been Jesuit or Catholic educated? I think that tells you the whole story. It's really the Jews, isn't it? Or did I get that reversed? I'm sorry, I got that backwards.
Well, you're absolutely right, Johnny. Maybe we should just end the whole show right now and not do.
We've been wrong. Michael Jones, Eugene Michael Jones has been right all the whole time. It's really the Jews.
Yes. So anyhow, as I said, this Martin, this younger Martin, he wrote the books, which is based. So HBO has been doing this series for like the last 7 or 8 years, and it's a huge international phenomenon. Not just in the English speaking world, but the non English speaking world. And people, we were talking about this the other day. Johnny and I were talking about this the other day, and he is surprised by how many ads he's seen for it. Um, and so, anyhow, there's a couple. So we talked about Martin, the creator of the show. There's a couple of. I only want to talk about a couple other things because I've probably gone on longer than I should have. Um, in America, it airs on HBO, Home Box Office, which was founded by Charles Francis Dolan in 1973. Dolan was born in 1926, and he attended John Carroll University in Ohio, but he did not graduate.
Otis,
Dolan is one.
are these is this guy related to all the Catholic Jesuit trained Dolans who recently owned Cablevision?
Are you talking about Jim Dolan?
Yeah, I can pull up the names. I found 3 Dolans. The Cablevision was recently sold off to Altice USA, which I found is a Jesuit-controlled company via the boards of directors. But Cablevision, I found. I'll pull up the names just because one of the Dolans, who is the longtime CEO of Cablevision, is currently on the board at Fairfield. I'll pull that up quickly here.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
it doesn't make any sense because Dolan is a Jewish name, isn't it? Is Dolan a Jew? Oh, no, I got that wrong again too. That's Irish Catholic. I'm sorry.
And not to be confused with Timothy Michael Cardinal Dolan, the Archbishop of New York.
Hey, George. So what we were talking about? Let me bring that up again. Is when Home Box Office first made its big splash. Its big selling point was to bring basically softcore pornography into your home via the television. You just have to pay for it. That was the big sell. I lived through it, but I'm showing my age. It was a big selling point. Go ahead.
Okay, so yes, basically, so you have Dolan who's worth billions of dollars. Now, most people have never heard of Chuck Dolan, even though in terms of say power, he's in the same league as Ted Turner or Rupert Murdoch. Now, I don't know if he's a Knight of Malta, but it wouldn't surprise me if he were, because in terms of how much. Now, Dolan has also been involved with the entertainment industry for decades, since at least the 1970s. In addition to owning or having owned HBO, I think he sold it off to Time Warner. But he had at one time or another owned the New York Rangers and the New New York Knicks. He had owned Madison Square Garden.
Well, you're speaking of James Dolan here. I have the names up here.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
James Dolan was the CEO of the Madison Square Garden. He's a Catholic, but he didn't go to a Jesuit school. The interesting one I found was Lawrence Dolan, retired attorney, principal owner of the MLB's Cleveland Indians. He attended St. Ignatius School and went to Notre Dame. Where is this here? Okay, and then Charles Dolan. He was an American billionaire. Yeah, Charles Dolan was the founder of Cablevision. Dolan today controls AMC Networks, MSG Networks, Newsday, and the Madison Square Garden Company. He served in the U.S. Air Force and went to Jesuit John Carroll, and is a trustee at Jesuit Fairfield University and is on the board of governors at the Catholic St. Francis Hospital. I just wanted to say that. So the Dolan, I bet this is this this Dolan you're talking about is connected to the entertainment industry. He's doubtlessly related.
That's unusual. That's unusual to have so many Roman Catholics involved in either television or sports. I wouldn't have expected that.
With the exception of the Pelosi family, of course.
But I'm gonna say it's to me it was the most unusual I found was that a priest, probably a fourth vow Jesuit priest, Daniel Aloysius Lord, SJ actually drafted the Hollywood motion picture code. Like, what's a priest doing, getting involved in Hollywood? Like what does that have to do
Well,
with like your priestly vows and like your
Eric,
living like the
obviously,
saintly life?
we rely upon the morality of a good Jesuit to write a solid moral code. We know you just have to disconnect your brain and see the collar and realize that there's nobody that knows more about morality and ethics than a good Jesuit. All you got to do is read that fourth vow oath to see how ethical and moral the Jesuits can be.
No, good, no, good points, and I recommend everyone, if you haven't read the Fourth Vow Oath, to do so, because yeah, that's a must read. It's a must read document, and it shows that you mentioned I have to watch this HBO show you guys are talking about, just because you mentioned, Johnny, how it's introducing like softcore pornography into the audience, and
Yeah, it
that's
was
just
just basically. Go ahead.
I was going to say quickly, part of the I've been recently looking into how the Jesuits in the Vatican are controlling the porn industry, and just one example I have here. This was an NY Times article. The founder of this website. This is like a hardcore porn site called Kink.com, but the founder of the site, Peter Ackworth, is a son of a Jesuit priest. For instance. So I think
I swear you sent that out to me earlier, and I was just as shocked when you said it at the time.
yeah, I sent it to I sent it to the whole team, but it shows that there's an intimate connection there. So I bet if you look just like the Hollywood actors, I bet if you looked at all the big time or the popular porn stars, the majority of them will be Catholic as well. Just I briefly started doing this. Just one of the big male porn stars, his name's Kieran Lee, and he's a Catholic, educated in Britain, for instance. But they control it all. Porn is a huge industry itself. Like the internet itself, I want to say is like 40% of porn. So it makes sense that founders of porn companies are sons of Jesuit priests.
Well, of course, Catholic apologists will say, conservative Catholics will say, well, they're not real Catholics.
Now, this is a huge point. This is a huge point because it shows you exactly where it is that the Catholic Church, I mean, who runs Rome right now? All you conservative Catholics, my mom, it's not my Pope. I got news for you, Mom. That's what everybody wants. Everybody wants a Jesuit running. And by the way, he's a fall guy anyway. There's no reason to have an outward Jesuit. They got the superior general really runs things behind the scenes. He's a fall guy. But it tells you exactly where the Catholic Church really, truly is with I hate to tell you this, Satan. The Catholic Church is evil. Everything it starts evil. Supposedly, devoutly pro-life, and with all the power of the Catholic Church, how many victories do we have against abortion?
Well, there was, I want to say, for the Satan angle, like there literally was like a telegraph, regardless of people's religious beliefs. I'm not a religious person in that sense, but there was, I want to say this was the chief Vatican exorcist literally said that the devil lives at the Vatican. That was like 2011, I think. So like they're coming out and saying that, like the Vatican is like a like a demonic energy is here. And just look at all the sex abuse cases that have opened up in the last like 5 years, and it makes sense that they're intimately involved in the pornographic industry. Just look at all the sex abuse cases. Like recent cases have opened up in Pennsylvania, like West Virginia, Buffalo, New York, all across the USA, Kansas, Missouri. Like I want to say like there's 15 open investigations now into sex abuse, and it's a systematic problem. Cardinal George Pell was just arrested. I think he got a slap on the wrist. I think he was sentenced to 6 years.
Well, it's kind of tough when the person that accused him ended up dying before they ever went to trial.
No, fair enough. I do think though that I don't know, from what I've read, that I think that there were multiple accusations, but it's progress. At least it shows that like they're not completely untouchable. So if enough evidence is brought to the table, that they will be punished in some degree.
Amazing. It's amazing that it got that far. Pell is the highest official. Usually it's just entry level priests that get accused of buggery. It's hardly
And
ever
it feels like just recently, Cardinal Bernard Law, after he like all the accusations came out against him, like he was actually involved in electing like Pope Francis. Like he was in the conclave. Like he was like promoted within the ranks of the Vatican after his scandal. And probably
Bernie
though, like
Law.
I just assume if Cardinal Pell like was found innocent, I think he doubtlessly probably would have had like it would have happened the same way to Pell also, like what happened to Law.
Bernie Law, the man who single-handedly enabled all the boy buggers of Boston to rape little kids with impunity again and again and again. And it's really very poignant the way that the movie Spotlight ends by showing how he had a nice, cushy retirement. He was welcomed home to Rome. Job well done, Bernie.
I have to. I've read the Spotlight articles. I have to watch the movie, but I found it was interesting that I think part of the reason why, like, it was decent reporting, but they could have gone much tougher on the Bernard Law and all in the Vatican and the priests in general. But one of the lead reporters on the Spotlight investigation, I think he went to Boston College. I don't have
Oh,
the
that
guy's name
sounds
up right there, but anyone can find that. If you look at the list of the Spotlight reporters, like the lead reporter went to Boston College. Which is
Well, look,
probably why
subterfuge.
they didn't go as hard as they could have went in putting pressure on the Catholic Church.
It was all subterfuge. They started the investigation in 2001 after their scapegoat John Gagan, who had his fill of raping little boys, was finally arrested and defrocked. One of only like 4 or 5 priests. You've got thousands of Catholic priests who have been raping children, and of them, I would say only 4 or 5 that come to mind who have actually been defrocked. Gagan had already been defrocked in '98 and had already been finally arrested by the Catholic oath-breaking scum cops and judges and prosecutors of Boston at that time when the brave Catholics at the Globe finally did their investigation. I'm sorry, when Marty Barron, the single Jewish man who became editor-in-chief, popped in and said, "Hey, you need to look at this again, guys. You didn't do a very thorough job." Marty Barron, who is now at the Washington Compost doing a good job as a front, what we might call papal court Jew, to take the spotlight for no pun intended, Jews in journalism dancing to the Roman tune.
Well,
Great
by the way,
information. Just really quickly on the Washington Post, I just read a recent Despicable article that they put up there recently. They did a smear job on Gary Webb. I don't know if you guys saw that hit piece, but they were calling Gary Webb they're calling him a bad reporter, saying like he was like lazy, that he didn't follow the story. They said that Gary Webb submitted his early reports to the Washington Post, and we exposed how bad his journalism was. Blah 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 blah. But it was just like shameful. Like they were smearing like a dead guy who, was obviously like killed by some intelligence agency. Like he shot himself.
No, he got depressed and shot himself in the face twice.
Oh, by the way, I mentioned this. Excuse me, fellas, if I could just throw in a couple things. You're talking about bad journalism. The fire department showing up after the fire is out. Well, somebody sent me something from December 2017. It was from Texas. There was an ex-Catholic priest named John Fite. He was like almost 90 years old. He was like 87, 88 years old, 87, 88. And he was convicted of a murder he had committed in the early 1960s. So almost 60 years earlier. It was in a town, as I said, near the Mexican border. There's a young woman who's like 25 years old. She was a school teacher, and she was a beauty pageant winner or contestant. She was like, she'd gone to him to confession, and he was the last person to see her alive. And her body was found in a field or something. And the police always suspected him. But finally, so anyhow, Fight, actually, in the early 1970s, left the priestcraft, got married, had a family, and I guess a couple of years ago, he decided to turn himself in. He said, "Yeah, you know what? I'm the one who killed that girl, back in the early 1960s," and so they sent him to prison. So I mean, I don't know the whole details of the case. Why did it take almost 60 years to bring him to justice? Was he, I mean, I realize in the early 1960s, they didn't have things like DNA or DNA testing or whatever, but they had fingerprints and things like that. They had most of the modern law enforcement techniques that we have now. So I just wondering, I have no proof of this, but was there somebody covering for him, like his
That's
bishop?
not fair, George. Things just worked a little slower back then. Okay, and honestly, I'm obviously that's tongue in cheek, but the reality is every time we see something, every time we see an arrest being made or the so-called journalists finally doing their friggin' job, it's usually well after the crimes have been committed, and whoever it was that was preying on the innocents have had their fill. 20, 30, 40, 50 years of raping kids or whatever the crime is. They've had their fill, and it's finally time to kick them to the curb. And justice is served. We've seen it again and again.
I mean, I don't mean to belabor the whole Jimmy Savile story, but I was vaguely familiar with him because I've seen clips of him from British TV shows. Jimmy Savile was basically like, for those who don't know, was like the Dick Clark of British television. He hosted a number of programs like Top of the Pops and Jim Can Fix It. And he died, he lived for, was it 26 to 2007, 1926 to 2011. So finally, after his death, all these stories come out about how since at least the 1950s, he had been abusing hundreds of kids all over the British Isles. The police had arrested, they had questioned him, things like that. But why did these stories not come out until after his death? I mean, he didn't spend one day in jail. He did not pay £1 in fines, or he was able to operate with impunity.
Well, I suggest it's probably the friendship, the close friendship he had with John Paul II and like Prince Charles and Queen Elizabeth. I would assume.
Well, we're just getting a hint of this. There's creepy Uncle Joe, Joseph Biden, the ex vice president under Obama, and he was a senator from Delaware, I believe. And I heard about this 8 years ago. Somebody sent me a clip. Oh, hey, you want to see something funny? Sure. And it's just like there are clips of Joe Biden going back to at least the 1990s, basically manhandling these little girls. And I said, wait a second. Nobody said anything about that. I mean, this is becoming an issue now. Well, I mean,
do we know if Biden is a member of the Bohemian Club?
I don't know that, but it wouldn't surprise me because isn't everybody? Okay.
Well, yeah, many have Richard. Presidents have been members of the Bohemian Club. Like Ronald Reagan, I know, was a member. Richard Nixon was a member. Like Gerald Ford as well.
Nixon, when he was recording his own, recording himself to keep himself from, trying to save himself. Actually, he did save himself after they tried to do him in, and he was pardoned by
Ford.
Commission. Was it Warren Commission? Warren Commission member, Congressman, later President Gerald Ford. Went out of his way to record himself saying that Bohemian Grove is, pardon my expression, the faggiest goddamn thing I've ever been to. Meanwhile, what are you doing there? Tricky Dick. What are you doing if you think it's so faggy?
I've heard that. Yeah, that's on the Nixon tapes. Yeah, that's a great recording. And after that, I think he says right after that I wouldn't even shake hands with anyone from San Francisco because he's like
yeah.
kind of like
Well,
gross.
we have to remember. This was him recording himself saying that. So the next question is, okay, Tricky Dick, what are you trying to disprove here? What are your leanings, buddy?
Yeah,
George,
I think doubtless, yeah, he was taking part in the Bohemian Grove. Nixon was as much like as nefarious as it gets.
Well,
Like how many,
actually,
like,
in
how
all
many
fairness,
with Nixon quickly, like how many dictators has he praised like when he was president? Like he was praising the dictatorship in Indonesia of Suharto. He was praising the dictatorship of Guillaume de Medici. Emphasized the Medici name, the military dictator of Brazil. Like Nixon went down to Brazil and like was like they had a toast together, and like he gave a speech saying like how democratic his regime was. Just shows like the nature of Nixon. Like he was very evil, to say the least. Like he personally signed a bill to bring the fascist Nikolai Malixa, who was also like a fascist and a communist at the same time. This was the richest industrialist in Romania, and Nixon signed like a personal bill to bring him over to the United States, and they even started like a front company called the Western Tube Corporation to give like Malixa like to make him look official while he was living in the U.S. so he could get his visa approved. So yeah, just if you look at Nixon's past, I think it alludes to him, like you said, possibly like his Bohemian Grove tape was a cover. And with Biden, I'm going to look into Joe Biden possible connections with the Grove and the Bohemian Club. Because the clips are very nefarious of him touching the little girls. Sorry, keep going.
George, before you jump in, I want to remind everybody who it is that runs Bohemian Grove. The Roman Catholic Knights of Hubertus, whom Antonin Scalia was a member of. In fact, he was at a Knight of Hubertus ranch, the Cibolo Ranch of John Poindexter.
Mm-hmm. Not to be confused with Admiral John.
And they've been accused of doing their little Susan Collins, the good old Susan Collins from Newtown, Connecticut, the brilliant writer Susan Collins, Susan, whatever the heck her name is, of hunting children and either raping them when they catch them or murdering them or whatever the case is, where she got her brilliant ideas. She's been accused of being a fraud herself.
Oh, okay. So anyhow, but just in defense of Tricky Dick, he may have done some engaging in some mild, light buggery when he was at Bohemian Grove, but I'm sure he did not inhale.
George, you need to define light buggery. I don't know if I follow that one.
Oh,
it was like Clinton smoking the joint, like supposedly Clinton
Yeah.
didn't inhale the joint.
I don't think so.
Well, okay, it's just like it's no different than say like Skull and Bones. They had to engage. I've heard they've had to engage in some really questionable stuff, but it's just like, hey, I don't mean it. It's just. I've heard people say like, well, I don't mean it. It's just like it's part of the ritual. I'm not a real sodomite. It's part of the initiation.
I'm saying there's a video on YouTube, but I don't know if this is actually good. I don't know how this is fabricated or not, but there's a video on YouTube of a supposed Skull and Bones like ritual, where like you hear a bunch of people like screaming and yelling, and it just sounds very chaotic. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's on YouTube still.
That's if that's where. Oh my goodness! If that's where the comedian turned talk show host Alex Jones there.
That possibly may have an Alex Jones origination. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's the only one I know of. Is the one that he supposedly crashed the Grove and gave that sanitized version of it. Meanwhile, you have people saying that what really goes on at the Grove is much worse than that. and that
Oh,
put him on top.
Jones doubtlessly crashed the Grove, but do you know if that like have you seen that Skull and Bones video of that like supposed um, initiation? It's
Oh,
kind of
I'm sorry. You're
similar
saying
to the.
Skull and Bones. I'm sorry. I'm getting that mixed up with the Bohemian Grove. I have not. I think I've seen the Skull and Bones initiation. That's completely separate. I'm sorry.
But that very possibly though has an Alex Jones origination. Just like it's
Sure.
been on the net for like 8 years. So if it does have a Jones origination, like it should be questioned, like in, like the legitimacy of it.
George, you trying to jump in?
Well, okay. This is something I've mentioned before. About 10 years ago, I went to a memorial service for someone who died.
Oh, I
And
thought you were going to say you went to Bohemian Grove 10 years ago.
well, not quite. Not quite. However, close. I went to Hannah. The memorial service was at Hannah's Boys Center in Sonoma, which is about roughly 30 miles or about 50 kilometers from the Bohemian Grove. And the fellow who died, he was there. He was at Hannah Boys Center in the 1960s. So, as I said, I went to this memorial service for this fellow. John was his name, and they after they had the service, you went to the reception hall for the food, and people could commiserate and all that. And on the walls in the reception hall are the pictures of famous people who have been to Hannah Boys Center. Bob Hope, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Bing Crosby, the big Caspar Weinberger. I mean, almost all the major power brokers of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Frank Sinatra has been there. Um, Dean Martin, you name it. John Wayne had actually been there, and it's just like it was like the thing. Most people don't know this, but if you're ever up in wine country, just north of San Francisco, oh, you want to go, to the Hannah Boys Center. And I know this is a bit off topic, but it's like almost like the Man's Chinese Theater in LA. It's like if you're a power player, if you were a power player, you know, back in the 60s and 70s and so forth, you need to stop by the Hannah Boys Center and get a picture of yourself with the Catholic priest, even though you yourself may not necessarily be openly Roman Catholic.
Well, it's interesting how well they get their big names to go out and parade for their, no different than the Jews at Metro Goldwyn Mayer blowing up Boys Town back in the 30s. For some reason, it was really important to those Hollywood Jews to blow up the boy buggerers at Boys Town so that later on they could be outed. I'm sorry. That's Franklin. That's the Franklin cover up. I got that mixed up. That's I was going to say the Boys Town cover up. That's Franklin cover up. Thanks to former almost monk John DeCamp, who was personally briefed by Joseph Ratzinger, Nazi youth Joseph Ratzinger, once when he was a member, when he was fronting the Inquisition. I got that mixed up again. That's not it's the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That's what it's called now. It's not the Inquisition anymore. I'm sorry. That was wrong. And then later again, when Ratzinger became Benedict number 16, he talked to him again. Really weird for somebody, a small town lawyer and legislator like DeCamp to have connections. Of course, he might have made those connections when he was part of Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, and he was the aide de camp of the Saigon station chief there, Bill Colby, who the warrior priest who would go on to become director of the Catholic Intelligence Agency. But it had nothing to do with farming boys out of Boys Town. The boys all went through the Navy, the Federal Credit Union there in Omaha. Nothing to do with getting them out of. Well, they had to come from somewhere. Anyway, there's a couple of
great information. I'm just if you want, John, just keep going on Boys Town. This is great information. I'm pulling up a book I got from the library recently, The Religious Empire, which is like analyzes like church assets, like primarily tax-exempt assets in the U.S. This was written. It was written in the 70s, but Boys Town is mentioned in the book. It's I'll read a little excerpt in a little bit, but it just shows how Boys Town was like a huge corporation. Like it had all sorts of assets. It had land. Had tangible like resources.
Oh, huge! Yeah, as a matter of fact, they were investigated for having a ridiculous amount of capital. People say, "Are you an orphanage? How do you have so much incredible amounts of capital? It's almost like you're pimping the little boys out to the rich and shameless." That's wow.
Well, that's exactly what was happening, and as you clearly point out in Eaters of Children, that was the cover up was to pin to cover up that the Boys Town was like the epicenter of like the crisis, and they pinned it on some like secular credit union, which was kind of ridiculous to think that like a credit union is the place where this was happening when like the Boys Town is like literally the source of like where the children were coming from. And like I'm pretty sure you mentioned in the book how like the Boys Town had accounts even at the credit union. So here's I'll read this too. I don't know if you've seen this source, Johnny. This is from the Religious Empire, page 222. It just goes into some of Boys Town's assets. I just thought this was fascinating. I'll just read here. It says, occasionally a religious project suffers from over-success and the resulting bonanza can be even more embarrassing than financial failure. A good example of this is provided by the Catholic project known as Boys Town in Nebraska. This is written in 1972, just for some clarification. The Boys Town in Nebraska, which for years hid its incredible prosperity under a cloak of secrecy. With some of the most knowledgeable fundraising techniques in the nation, Boys Town steadily built its vast resources as it became by far the wealthiest institution of its kind in the world. What person with income has not received the famous Boys Town Christmas appeal, which shows one boy carrying another on his back, explaining to the sympathetic priest, quote, "He ain't heavy, father, he's my brother," end quote. That's interesting.
Yeah, outstanding.
Many will remember the equally heart-rendering appeal sent to more than 34 million homes. Quote, "There will be no joyous Christmas season this year for many homeless and forgotten boys. With your help, we can make a home at Boys Town for as many of these homeless boys as we can accommodate." Well, that's revealing. So like, they were attracting, children who are like very vulnerable, being homeless children, easy to prey upon. But here's some of the financial information here. It says Boys Town managers found themselves sitting on assets of $226 million. 226 million, which they literally did not know what to do with, the authors say.
Well, I know it's hard to have millions of dollars, and you don't know what to do. You just throw. If you're cold, you just put it in the fireplace and warm yourself up with your millions. What an embarrassing situation. What was I going to say as far as?
Yeah, chime in on this if you want.
Oh my goodness, I had something on the tip of my tongue with that I was going to throw out there. Go ahead, George.
Well, yeah, that reminds me. Years ago, this reminds us a bit about. This is a bit off topic. That reminds me of commercials I used to see for Shriners Hospitals or for St. Jude's. Is this somewhat similar situation where Shriners has hospitals for burn victims, and they have these cute little kids. They say, "Oh, would you please donate to Shriners Hospital because thanks to them, I now have a new lease on life." And St. Jude's has made similar appeals, which was it was pitched by the late Danny Thomas, who is Lebanese Catholic, Melkite, and his daughter Marla Thomas has taken over the mantle since Danny died. So they like, whether you're talking about Boys Town in Nebraska, St. Jude's, Shriners, they like to pull at your heartstrings. Now, I know this is odd because technically speaking, Rome is at odds with Freemasonry, but we all know who actually is calling the strings. So they they often will do something that appears to be beneficial, helpful. Feeding the homeless, or feeding poor, poor people, or helping burn victims, or whatever the case may be. But it doesn't. They use this as a cloak to hide the real agenda,
They actually
or
prey
real.
upon the very defenseless and helpless people they're supposedly helping.
It was, their
Yes.
cartel capitalist system of economics creates a situation where the majority of the, quote, peasants, as Nelson Rockefeller would say, have barely any wealth at all. So they become like reliant on these, quote, donations, given from the Catholic charity services. So,
Well,
the church
that's
creates
exactly what
the, sorry, what are you saying, Johnny?
that's exactly what what's his name, Vinay said. If you see, you take these poor people who are desperate for help and compassion, and you give them a little, you will become their Messiah. That's exactly what he said. That's a good.
Well, in Venezuela, right now with the coup, I just thought this was fascinating. The Catholic Church's approval rating is like 90% in Venezuela.
That's pretty sad.
That shows you that like what you just said is absolutely true because like they're doing like quote unquote humanitarian work down there in Venezuela.
Turning that country upside down. The home nation of the current Superior General Arturo Sosa.
Oh, absolutely, and it's like in Latin America across the board. That's where like a lot of the charity work, a lot of the money ends up going into South America. But it's like that all across the board. You're dealing with countries that are like miserably like impoverished, with the Catholic Church, with like being like the richest landowners in the land, and they're the ones who are, giving the aid to these people through charity. But they're the ones who are making people poor in the first place.
Wherever the Catholic Church is dominated, there's nothing but chaos and devastation in the wake.
Well, excuse me. I know we covered this last summer. That reminds me of Wells of Life in Uganda. Um, okay, so that country was destroyed over 40 years ago.
Quickly, George, before you go on, I did a write up on Wells of Life on my Jesuit World Order blog post. I documented some of the stuff. Keep going.
Okay, please send me a link to that because I actually have not read that. But anyhow, so in the 1970s, the Catholic Intelligence Agency, with the help of I guess the MI6, installed Idi Amin, who is probably about as vicious, bloodthirsty of a monster as you're going to ever find. I mean, he's in the same league, even though he didn't put up the same numbers as say Hitler or Stalin or Mao. Relatively speaking, in terms of the amount of devastation he wreaked.
I'm pretty sure he was a cannibal. Also, just to quickly mention, I'm pretty sure I've seen sources that he ate like human flesh. Shows how wicked he was.
Okay. So he was installed by the Catholic Intelligence Agency with help from MI6. And according to Eric John Phelps, and I believe it, he was a temporal coadjutor. Even though he was a Freemason, communist, atheist Muslim, Sunni Muslim, he was doing the bidding for. Now I know that may sound like a bad joke, but he was doing the bidding of the Vatican. He extirpated a minimum of 250,000 people in a 4-year period between 1975 and 79. By the way, which was the same reign of terror as Pol Pot's. Almost all of them were Protestants, and the majority of them were Anglicans, but they weren't officially Catholic. So once he finished his business, he got out of Dodge and spent the rest of his life in Saudi Arabia. And when I shared this with Johnny last year, but after Amin's death in 2003, a report came out in one of the British papers, I believe the Guardian or the Independent or one of them, said, "Oh yes, they say MI6 installed him," which reminds me of something that, and you could say, or reminds me of a couple of things. You could say that Amin was the perfect dictator because he gave Rome almost complete plausible deniability. They could say, "Oh, what do you mean what he did was an Inquisition or crusade? He wasn't Catholic. He was a communist Muslim, Freemasonic thug. He didn't work for Rome.
Well, one of what I have the name of one of the Catholic Intelligence Agency's agents who was one of Amin's handlers. His name was Frank Turple,
Mhm.
and the Guardian newspaper did a story on it. It says Frank Turple, how a CIA spy went rogue to court the world's worst dictators.
Oh, that absolutely he went rogue, because that is not what the CIA wanted to happen.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny how they phrase that there. Oh, he's a rogue agent, he's breaking from the
Yes,
party line, as if
he did
as if
not.
the CIA hasn't supported dictators in the past, before this
They
point.
would never do that. The CIA would never support a vicious dictator that raped, pillaged, and cannibalized his own people. They would never allow that.
Well, that reminds me, this might sound like a trivial point, but you could say the CIA is a hitchhiker in that it can't get around. I mean, even though it's one of the largest organizations, governmental organizations in the US, it almost always has to do something else. It has to collaborate with some other entity, the US Army, the mafia, some other foreign intelligence agency like MI6, the Mossad.
Was a big one
Uh,
I'm doing more research into recently is the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency.
yes.
Oh,
So they basically,
that sounds familiar. That's not the same Defense Intelligence Agency that poor General Flynn ran, is it?
It is that one, yes. And interestingly, the first director of the DIA, which leads to me thinking it was a Jesuitical, like intellectually created agency, was General Joseph Francis Carroll was the first secretary of the DIA, appointed by Robert McNamara. But Carroll, as you can tell with the last name, he devout Catholic, was going to become a Catholic priest, and was educated by the Jesuits at Loyola Chicago. And I found just I don't have all the names up here on my computer right now, but I found no less than like 4 or 5 heads of the DIA that have been trained by Jesuits. Just another one on the top of my head is David Shedd. Shedd spent 33 years with the CIA. He was a Georgetown graduate. Interestingly, this Jesuit trained David Shedd with the CIA drafted the executive order. Well, what was the? I don't know the number of the executive order. He drafted the executive order that gave less congressional oversight to the CIA.
Is he civilian or military?
So you see, like unelected officials, representing the Jesuits control U.S.
Because
policy. But I have the Frank Turple here just on the Guardian paper. This is what I wanted to mention this earlier. The paper says here that the name of this article is CIA rogue, quote, rogue spy courts world's worst dictators. But apparently, during an interview broadcast in the 1982 documentary Confessions of a Dangerous Man, Frank Turple admitted to having a permanent office in the, quote, State Researches Institution in Kampala, Uganda. And it says here, Amin's enemies are known to have been tortured in the basement of that building. So it's interesting that the CIA, Frank Turple's head office is in the same building where Idi Amin tortured his victims. And this shouldn't be too surprising, just knowing the history of the CIA. Like, it was the devout Catholic Dan Mitrione, childhood friend of Jim Jones, who went down to South America in the 50s and set up like the torture programs for like the governments of Uruguay and Brazil. The CIA has a long history of torture.
Vicious monster who was also a chief of police as well.
Oh, great information! Actually, and that's how Jones. Jones was friends with him, and that was in Indiana, in Jones's hometown.
Right, that's how they connected. Yeah, what a coincidence.
But George, if you want to go more into Idi Amin, but I think the CIA connection to Amin, and his father was a Catholic. I think we mentioned on a previous show, but I think the CIA direct connection to him, as well as the MI6 ones that we haven't covered here, but the Catholic Intelligence Agency in particular, Frank Turpel's office is where Idi Amin tortured people. I think that shows that he was a plant of the machine.
Well, you see, something I mentioned is I'm sure Johnny will talk about this, but the Amin's reign of terror was, I believe, 1975 to 1979, which was almost the exact dates of the killing fields over in Cambodia. Their leader was Pol Pot. I forgot his real name. Saratha or something. Not Sarat. But Pol Pot lived from 1926 to 97, I believe. Is going from memory, and he was educated at a Catholic school in Phnom Penh. Now, I'm not sure if it were run by the Jesuits, but it may have very well have. So we know that Pol Pot led the Khmer Rouge, which were, and they're basically in the same league as Amin. Absolutely vicious, bloodthirsty killers. I mean, for want of a better expression. And they too were also installed by the CIA. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the purpose was behind that, but something I've read from other sources, and I can send you both copies of this. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, Cambodia was stabilizing economically. It was becoming a somewhat prosperous country. They had a small but burgeoning middle class. And that wasn't just in the 1950s, just prior to the Castro Revolution in the late 1950s, you had a similar situation in Cuba. Also, in the circumstances were similar in Venezuela in the 1980s and early 1990s before Hugo came to power. So you had countries, Cambodia, Buddhist. You have Venezuela, which is historically Catholic, and same thing with Cuba. But they had middle class. They were established class, and even though I guess, and the Jesuits hate the middle class because even though that appears to be a threat to, may not be a threat to them religiously, but it's definitely a threat to them economically.
Well, in the Protestant West, fueled by the Protestant work ethic, the middle class has broken free of Roman feudalism better than any other, and so Rome despises that fact and wants to do anything possible. This is why the reason why there's a new false flag, every 2 weeks now, because Rome absolutely despises the fact that someone in the middle class can own property and defend it with a gun. Mm-hmm. It just
no, absolutely. In the trends worldwide is the middle class is shrinking everywhere. Just recently, in Canada, there was an OECD report. I don't know the abbreviation. It's like an economics think tank, but they do economics research, and they reported that the Canadian middle class is rapidly shrinking. It has decreased like 10 or 15% in the last 20 years. And like it's like, and it literally says, like, the National Post covered it. It says like young Canadians will be poorer than their parents were. And then it said like, and now like before, like when like in the 50s and 60s, it was kind of like it was everyone, like mostly everyone joined the middle class. It was like a regular thing. But now it's becoming like almost like a privilege, especially in America. Like the middle class in America is like devastatingly being hit. But like it's almost becoming now like a privilege just to be in like the middle class bracket of society.
Well, feudalism is the goal.
And just with Cuba, I covered this in the video I did on China. Just if you want to jump in here, George, it shows that like, the United States is willing though to sacrifice their foreign commercial interests if the interests of the Jesuits are at hand. And General Reinhard Gehlen, in his book The Service, the Memoirs of Reinhard Gehlen, on page 237, literally blames the United States for giving absolutely zero aid to Batista when Castro was organizing his revolution. And he blames the U.S. for Batista being ousted by Castro. And he says the reason the U.S. didn't aid Batista at all is because Castro's devout Jesuit schooling. And he says because of Castro's Jesuit schooling, the U.S. thought that he would, quote, bring democracy to the world.
give me that source again. What's the source again?
That was in Reinhard Galen's book, The Service. The Memoirs of Reinhard Galen, page 237. I plan on scanning the book in sometime soon. But like, it's an incredible admission that he admits the U.S. botched.
Wasn't he Catholic as well?
Yeah, he was made a Knight of Malta in 1948. That I've seen that sourced on like 8 different sources. He made a Knight of Malta in 1948. And yeah, Galen himself, like on his obituary, it says he was one of the founders of the Mossad intelligence service. Interestingly, and in Covert Action Information Bulletin, they didn't give the name of Galen's brother, but it's claimed that Reinhard Galen's brother was an advisor to the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, for instance. So it's Galen, knew what was going on. So it's an incredible admission that he admitted that the reason the U.S. sacrificed their assets in Cuba was because of Castro's Jesuit schooling.
Well, just because you're a papist doesn't mean you're dishonest. Just because you're a Nazi papist doesn't mean you're not beyond telling the truth.
No, absolutely. G. Gordon Liddy had a similar moment. In his book, his autobiography, Will, he had kind of a similar, I thought, a shocking revelation. Liddy, like Galen, wasn't the most moral of individuals. You could say that. But Liddy literally admitted that Heinrich Himmler modeled his SS Gestaffel off of the Jesuit order. I was shocked that he put that in that's in an establishment book. So you can't claim it's a conspiracy theory when G. Gordon Liddy's saying it. Maybe if it's coming from a chick pub, you could get away with smearing the accusation. But when it's coming from an establishment source like G. Gordon Liddy, it shows it's official.
I have looked at Liddy's. Go ahead, George.
I'm sorry for interrupting, Johnny, but I've shared this before. But I read a mainstream book fairly recently. Paul Preston's book. He wrote "The Spanish Civil War: A Modern Inquisition," and he says in the foreword, it was as much of, even though it took place in the 1930s, it was as much of a religious war as had taken place in the 16th or 17th centuries. So it was this is Heston, as I said. This is a mainstream book which I checked out at my local library. He said it was as much of a religious war of anything that had taken place in the 16th or 17th century. And it was, and as said, the actual title was "The Spanish Civil War: A Modern Inquisition." So this is something I've said before. When the first 30 Years' War ended in 1648, I'm just speculating here. The Jesuits learned some lessons. We said, you know what, from now on, we need to be, when we orchestrate these conflicts, we need to be a little bit more clever about it. We need to give it a secular cover. So people, to justify this conflict and to get people to participate, we need to say that it's for some other reasons. It's to become independent. It's to fight communism. It's to fight Nazism. It's to fight, well, now to fight terrorism. But make sure that people don't know the real reasons for the conflict.
Well, absolutely, and create Hegelian dialectical fronts, the Jesuits played it out where they there was no way they couldn't win in the end with their objectives, with Hitler launching the Second Front, Operation what was it? What was the name? Belarus. Yeah, literally named the operation to invade Soviet Russia after the Roman Empire. That was literally a suicide wish for the Nazis, for the Germans. But what that did though was ensured that that essentially ensured the Cold War would come into being, because the U.S. through the Lend-Lease program literally rebuilt the Soviet economy and war machine, headed up by Jesuit Joseph, late Jesuit, I think Joseph Stalin in between 1941 and 1944. Like I published or Anthony Sutton. I found recently a PDF of his series Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, the trilogy series. It's like a 1,200 pages and just thoroughly documented how like the West, like American and German companies and like British companies, like, literally like there's no Soviet Union without the West. Like all their technology was copied from Western manufacturers. Like all their tanks. Like Ford built a plant in Gorky, the Gorky plant in Russia, and they started making gas vehicles, which were literally Ford vehicles. For instance,
Ford did both. Ford took care of the Nazis, and Ford took care of the Soviets at the same time. Anthony Sutton, boy, there's nobody better. As long as you don't want to see the word Jesuit or Catholic or Roman or anything, nobody's better than Anthony Sutton. But if you want to know what Rome was doing, then well, you're gonna have to read somebody else.
Absolutely, that's why I think Sutton's research is very valuable, but you have to have the background information on how, because it connects what Sutton was saying. But like the Jesuits came into this dialectic where like they made sure that Stalin would come out victorious as an artificially induced, artificially created superpower that they would then use in the Cold War, for the next 30 years as a manufactured enemy back in the United States to get, because the war on communism like was an excuse for all sorts of, covert operations all across the world. It was an excuse to build up the police state in the United States, for instance. But, like they completely created the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, like built it up to its like modern infrastructure. And it just shows you like the Jesuit dialectic at the end of the war. Like Hitler's, and like I think that there's no coincidence that Hitler's mission to invade the Soviet Union was named after like a Roman emperor. I think that just shows like like the grand plotting of this to lead from the Second World War directly into the Cold War. But like absolutely, like I think George, you're spot on though. If you want to keep going on this point, that the Jesuits learned to get behind secular governments after the first 30 Years' War.
Well, and of course, and to give people some sort of cloak, you're talking about the Hegelian dialectic, and I brought this up before. So we've established the Jesuits created communism about 40 years ago in South America, but they also created anti-communism. They created modern Zionism, and they're behind modern anti-Semitism. Has existed long before the Jesuits were around, but they basically gave it skin and bones, if you will. And so here in the United States, the Jesuits run the Democrats, and they run the Republicans. They run right-wing radio, or so-called right-wing radio, and they run left-wing radio.
George, flesh that out because it's such an important point. The paradigm is you've got two sides. You've got the far communist, vicious, satanic, no exaggeration, the far communist, vicious, satanic left, and you've got frauds who talk the talk and never, ever, ever walk the walk on the phony right. And the far left, vicious, communist, satanic left always wins. All you got to do is look at American politics to see that paradigm.
Well, okay, so what they'll do, what the pseudo right will do, they'll throw a bone to the people. They say, "Oh yes,
at least we can say Christmas again. At least we can say Merry Christmas again."
Well, yeah.
Now that Donald Trump is president, we can say Merry Christmas again.
Okay. So anyhow, this is speculation. I'm not going to go off of this. I think Ronald Reagan was a complete puppet when he was president, but I think at the beginning of his administration, he may have gone off script. That's a possibility because he is trying to, for a while, for like a month or two, he may have thought he was actually the president. So that's why he could have had the little mishap with, allegedly John Hinckley. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Hinckley was Catholic, I'm pretty sure, and just to say Reagan was like a puppet of theirs, I think may even be an understatement. Like as a sitting U.S. president, he was knighted into the Knights of Malta at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Like just incredible like submission, right there to the Vatican, like being displayed.
Yes, I understand. But the problem with Reagan for them was he may have actually forgot who put him in power, and he actually may have thought that he was president, and he almost got the JFK treatment. That's just speculation on my part. But after he survived his assassination attempt, he he got completely in line. Does that sound plausible?
I love it. Yeah.
I definitely, and I'll have to look at the dates, but I bet if like the interventions in like Operation Gladio in South America under Reagan, that like the American destabilization of South America is another Hegelian dialectic played by the Jesuits. On one hand, you have like the Jesuits and the primarily the Knights of Malta and like Opus Dei, like getting behind these like right wing governments that are creating these death squads, which are creating these chaotic situations, which are forcing people to flee up into the United States. And on the other side of the dialectic, though, in those countries, you have the Jesuits with the liberation theology, kind of preaching like a pseudo Marxist doctrine that they try to resonate this like Marxist doctrine with the Gospels. So, like for the poor people down there, it's very resonating, and it creates all sorts of tension, which ultimately has led to this mass exodus of all these people from South America up to the United States. But I think that master plan for this current immigration crisis was kicked off under Reagan. It'd be interesting to see if those interventions began after he was shot, because Reagan did like later in his administration he did sign an amnesty bill. I know that, which he kind of began like the process of the legalization.
That was Tip O'Neill promised that hey, if you just do this, Ronnie, we'll get off your back. Devout drunk Roman Catholic Tip O'Neill, who was in charge of who was Speaker of the House at the time, and it's poor Ronnie. He's got a bad rap, George. Just because everything that Ronnie did went south, that doesn't mean that he was a bad conservative president. More gun control, the firearm owners, the inversely named Firearm Owners Protection Act that destroyed gun rights, the illegal amnesty that he signed, increase of taxes. But other than that, Ronnie was a great conservative. Right, George?
Well, again, like a lot of it, just really quick, I've just noticed something before you jump in, George. A lot of these phony Republicans, like they're super anti-government, like on the appearance, which is ironic because government spending always like increases usually under like recent Republican presidents. But on the surface, they're all anti-government. But when it comes to giving money to the military, which is a branch of the government, then they're all for giving money to the government.
What's weird about that, Eric and George, is that Ronnie had a background of being a staunch, hardcore right-wing conservative, didn't he, George? He was born and raised hard right-wing. I'm pretty sure, George, wasn't he?
Well, you could say that he had a Donald Trump / Newt Gingrich background. He was a fairly leftist Democrat. For decades, he campaigned in the 1940s. He campaigned for both FDR and Harry Truman. But he got married for the second time in the early 1950s to Nancy Davis. And the story goes it was Nancy's father, Loyal, Ronnie's new father-in-law, who converted him because Nancy was okay, you probably don't need to know this. Both the Reagans were from, Ronnie and Nancy were from Illinois. Ronnie was from the country, and Nancy was from Chicago, where her dad was a doctor. So after he retired, the Davises moved to Phoenix, where they basically rubbed elbows with the major of their day. And I've shared this before. Barry Goldwater, Jack McCain, the father of the late Senator John McCain, Gordon Luce, the son of, as well as their parents, Henry and Claire Booth Lewis. Um, they're also friends with Vince. Uh, uh, one of the fellows who went down on the Titanic, Vincent, not Morgan. Uh, I'm drawing. Um,
Oh, Astor.
Astor, yes, Vincent Astor. So, as it just so happens, the neighbors, the Davises were neighbors with all these people. As a matter of fact, they're the ones. Uh, Barry Goldwater is the one who got Lonnie into golfing. And so they said, so I read in the book last year, they said, hey, Ronnie, would you be interested in getting into politics? I said, well, not really. It's not, I mean, I don't mind, campaigning, but I'm just not willing to, uh, you doing campaigns. And they said, well, let me just talk to some people, and who knows, maybe you can be like governor of California someday, or who knows, maybe you in the White House. Oh, okay. So anyhow, he had. I'm going way off
George,
track.
you need to do an hour. You need to do an hour of the show in your Ronnie Reagan voice. By the way, I'm in case my sarcasm wasn't being picked up on. Ronald Reagan was a hardcore communist for almost all of his political life. When he popped on the scene, and then he was magically rebranded as a conservative. And he's even worse than that, George. Wasn't Daddy? Didn't Daddy baptize him Roman Catholic? Daddy, the Knight of Columbus, Daddy.
Well, yes, John Reagan, Jack, was, as you said, was a Knight of Columbus. Now, his mom, Ronnie's mom, Nell, was Disciples of Christ, which they're an offshoot of the Presbyterians. So they grew up in a mixed household. And Ronnie's older brother, Neil, were practicing Irish Roman Catholic. And yes, they're both Knights of Columbus.
Well, just really
Also,
quickly, the Knights of Columbus, the current Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, Carl Anderson, he was trained by the Jesuits at Seattle University, but he was one of Ronald Reagan's personal advisors in the White House, and he's the current Supreme Knight. It's very
okay, but just to give you some background on Ronnie, and I probably have covered this before. I was reading a book about him. It was called Ronnie and Nancy, a love story. And one of Reagan's girlfriends when he was in college was a Roman Catholic. I forgot her. He had several. Uh, and his first wife, Jane Wyman, who grew up Episcopalian, actually became Catholic, and she actually became a Dominican nun. So one of
George, that's a
Reagan's
great point. George, that's great. I did not know that about Jane Wyman. That's crazy.
Yeah. So anyhow, so Reagan had 5 children, one of whom was Michael. Michael to Loyola High School in Los Angeles.
very telling.
At least 2 of his children.
By the way, hold on, before you leave Michael was adopted, and Michael also has sexual abuse in his past.
Yes. So anyhow, they need
as a victim or as a perpetrator.
Yes, as a victim, and I guess I don't know, as a foster child or an orphan. He never he claims to adore Papa Ronnie, but he does have, I guess, prior to his being adopted. Then I don't know the details. I just know that.
Okay. So, anyhow, so at least 2 of his children. So Reagan had 5 children. At least 2 of whom ended up becoming Catholic, or at least one of them, Maureen Reagan, who died back in 2000 or so. She's actually buried in a Catholic cemetery in Sacramento, California. So anyhow, it's just like you could say that Ronald Reagan was like the C.S. Lewis of politics and entertainment. Now they say technically speaking was not Catholic, but almost everybody around him was.
Oh, everyone. That's why I think he was a secret Catholic. Like there's no like seeing like just analyzing his actions. Like there's no doubt he's a secret Catholic. And to tip it off was like the signing of diplomatic relations to the Vatican, and like that was done by William Wilson was the first ambassador from the U.S. to the Vatican, and William Wilson handled like Ronald Reagan's personal bank accounts.
That's with Protestant evangelical Billy Graham whispering in his ear, "Go, Ronnie, go! Sign back up with the Vatican."
Well, I think Billy Graham is like Peter J. Doiswick mentioned this, and he's a former Catholic priest. He was a priest in Omaha, but he wrote a book in 1960 called Catholic Victory in 1960, and he said there are many Jesuit agents who are disguised as Protestant preachers like in our country. And this Billy Graham to me screams of like he was a secret Jesuit. It's hard to prove, but like all of the books on the order say that there are secret Jesuits in disguise, posing as Protestants.
No different than C.S. Lewis, right, George?
Well, yes. And of course,
did you see it yet?
Well, yes, I did. And speaking of somebody from the British Isles, this is something I've long suspected, but I've never been able to corroborate this. But I think that John Nelson Darby was a Jesuit. I have no proof of it, but it's just like almost he's considered to be the father of British dispensationalism, and he's considered to be the spiritual father of Cyrus Schofield. And now, Darby was a lawyer. He was a deacon originally in the Church of Ireland, which is the Irish version of the Anglican Church. And he's involved with the Plymouth Brethren, like in the 1830s or so, 1830s. Now, Darby never married. That in of itself is not necessarily
real quick. Abraham Bram Stoker of Dracula fame was Church of Ireland, and Aleister Crowley was Plymouth Brethren.
Oh, well, Dave Hunt was also Plymouth Brethren.
Oh, what a great job!
I've seen this quote. I think it came from your website. Aleister Crowley in the Book of the Law said, "If the Jesuits don't hold that the ends justify the means, I do." Aleister Crowley said that.
Outstanding.
In the Book of the Law.
Outstanding.
Okay, so
you want Darby if you want George, but it isn't. I think it is intriguing that he didn't marry, just because like the Jesuit agents that are super read in, like tend to not marry, like the fourth.
Darby and Schofield helped destroy Rome in Christian eschatology and prophecy. Darby and Schofield single-handedly erased Rome. So, George, you got to have something there.
Well, but I have now. Darby or Schofield did marry. He was married at least twice. As I said, maybe concurrently, but that's besides the point.
Schofield married a Catholic and abandoned her.
Oh, that I did not know that. Well, I mean, I don't mean to say like this is like this borders on ad hominem. It was just like saying he probably kicked his dog also. But however, Schofield lived from 1843 to 1921, and as I said, he's considered to be the father of American dispensationalism, or the American version. You could say that he was the American version of Darby.
Also, the pre-tribulation rapture.
Yes. Now, in addition to possibly being a bigamist, he was a charlatan. I mean, for want of a better expression. I mean,
yeah, check kiter. He was sent to prison for kiting checks for writing fake checks.
Well, in addition to that, he claimed to be a lawyer, and he never took the bar. I'm sorry.
Forging checks. Yeah, good one. Yeah. He had a Catholic wife and 2 little girls, and he abandoned them all.
Oh, okay. Also, he claimed to be a lawyer, even though he never took the bar exam. Now, he did clerk for his brother-in-law, who was a lawyer somewhere, but he never actually took the exam. Now, the rules were a little bit different back then in the 19th century. You didn't have to necessarily go to law school. It was more of to be a lawyer is more like an apprenticeship. You studied under a lawyer, then when you thought you were ready, you took the exam. Also, he said that he was a doctorate of divinity, even though he at most a high school education, if that. Also, for good measure, now this is where we get into kicking the dog. Uh, he he was a bounty jumper. For those who don't know, during the war between the states, the Jesuitically fomented war between the states, Schofield was from Michigan, but he enlisted in multiple units. And during the war between the states, you had if you signed up, you got something called a bounty. We call it a bonus today, which is fairly substantial. It's several $100s, like maybe depending on $700, which is a huge amount of money for back then. So he actually he I guess deserted from several regiments in the north. Now, so I know that may sound like a trivial observation, but that shows a pattern.
It's an historical fact admitted by like mainstream professors that at Jesuit schools at the time of the Civil War, like the overwhelming majority of alumni at Jesuit schools favored the Confederacy's cause. So I found just on a book on DuPont, like Samuel DuPont, one of the generals in the North, like was accused of treason for botching an invasion at Charleston, South Carolina, which allowed the South to win that battle. And like while this DuPont he was like kind of sympathetic to the South cause. Which is interesting. I just mentioned that it's interesting that the Schofield guy deserted his regiments in the North just because.
And at the same time, George, and Eric, you've got papist monsters like Sherman needlessly burning and razing and raping and pillaging through the South when it was not in any way necessary to do a scorched earth approach in a civil war. And he would go on to sire a Jesuit priest himself. His little
Dresden or Hiroshima or Nagasaki?
Sorry, no. It sounds like we are, but we're actually talking about the United States South in the 19th century.
Oh, okay. I get those all confused because
you get confused with Protestant Germany during World War II, which was then further punished after the war by the Soviets. That was arranged by Father Ledakowski and Father Walsh before the.
Anthony's on Germany and Anthony Sutton's book Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, like entire German plants that were like in the Soviet occupied zone, like were packaged up and sent to the Soviet Union. Like German patents were sent to the Soviet Union, German scientists. So the Jesuits really truly did punish Germany after the war, and they put a papist in charge of at least West Germany, like the western side of Eisenhower, and Eisenhower, stacked his cabinet with the ex-Nazis, and that's where Reinhard Gehlen, ended up in West Germany. Yeah, like an ex-Nazi Knight of Malta who created their intelligence service, which further was enacting draconian measures on the populace there.
Well,
that's Protestant northeastern Germany. Go ahead, George.
Oh, okay. So I mean, there's like between Eric and me, whom was the Vatican supporting, during the war between the states? Was it the North or was it the South? And you can make arguments on either side. Well, regardless of whom she was ultimately wanted to win, one of her goals was to make sure as many Protestants on both sides suffered and died unnecessarily.
Well, actually, I would just say really quickly, like how the Vatican got behind the Soviets and the Nazis. Like she got behind the South and the North. I think you could say more openly she got behind the South, but like there were Vatican agents on the northern side as well. Like that was Sherman, for instance.
Well, of course, you have to say, this is something like Jesuitism 101. The open but false policy, but secret but true policy. Eric, you mentioned how, I'm paraphrasing, how I guess Pius IX, who was the Pope at the time, was sending letters to Jefferson Davis. Said, "Oh yeah, Jeff, we're rooting for you. Yeah, we have your back. Nice, wink, wink. Um, and of course, I think as with World War II, later on in the 1940s, for the most part, the generals on both sides were working together because Lee, who was an Episcopalian, was a high-level Freemason. Grant, who grew up Methodist but became an Episcopalian, was also a high-level Freemason. And most of the generals on both sides were somehow or directly or vicariously working for the Jesuits. There were, probably a few exceptions here and there. Maybe Stonewall Jackson. As far as I could tell, he was not read in. But then again, things didn't turn out too well for him. And same thing was the case with Rommel later on in World War II.
Oh, World War II with the generals in World War II, it was overwhelming. Like just really quickly, Avro Manhattan and Catholic imperialism and world freedom. He cites this occurrence in 1950, where 5 U.S. generals successively went to see the Pope, like one after another, like the top-ranking U.S. military officials.
Like Mark Clark.
Yeah, Mark Clark was one of them. And actually, Mark Clark, when Truman was president, he was actually going to become like an official ambassador to the Vatican in 1952. But Protestant opposition at that time was more in the open. I think there was enormous opposition to it. But Mark Clark, I found, was also a Knight of Malta. But the fact that like 5 U.S. generals consecutively went to see the Pope, like shows like they're completely subordinate to the Vatican.
No. So I presume that would have been Pius XII. Now I just wondering, did Eisenhower ever see Pius XII when he was general? I know he saw him when he was president of the U.S., but did he ever actually see him when he was still a general?
Well, I'm not sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. Like in Terror Over Yugoslavia, Avro Manhattan shows that Pavlich, when Eisenhower became president, sent him a cable giving him his divine blessing for the victory. So, like, he was doubtlessly, tracing Eisenhower's activities and keeping up with them, like when he was general in the U.S. Army.
Well, I mentioned this on the show last year before you joined us, Eric, a year ago, that Eisenhower, as a young man, he coached football, American football, at St. Mary's College in San Antonio, Texas. He did this, shortly after he got out of West Point. And I realized, probably, we weren't United States. This would have been like 1915 or so. And I'm sure he had a little bit of downtime, and so that in and of itself.
George, I think it was a brilliant find. Very, very unusual. What was his background in football? Was he like really good in football prior to this? No. So basically, the Catholic Church just found some place where he could collect a paycheck. Would you say that was the case?
Well, actually, he was, from what I understand, he was a decent athlete. He was a Midland basketball player. He wasn't very good at baseball, but I mean, as I said,
he was a great football. He was a great football coach. He might not have known a single friggin' thing about football, but he was a great football coach.
Oh, okay. So I know this is off. Okay, so that almost reminds me of something we talked about a year ago. Was Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in the late 1880s during the Jack the Ripper situation? Warren was a soldier and he was an engineer, but he didn't know the first thing about law enforcement. He was not a cop. I mean, I know there's some similarities between being a soldier and being a cop, but
it's exactly the same thing, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
It's exactly the same thing when you have to, investigate crime. And I mean, there's exactly the same. Well, it's sort of the same. Well, it's close. Well, maybe not.
So, and of
Well,
course,
in today's, I'd say in today's age, it's way closer than it
That's
used
true.
to be.
True.
'Cause,
Unfortunately, true.
police
Police
police departments are basically militaries at this point.
oh, okay,
and I
but
will say this again: every cop that puts on olive drab and camouflage is a traitor.
mhm. Well, and of course, I've mentioned this to you before about Eisenhower. I didn't mean to pick on him. Well, okay, I'll pick on him. One of the things he did, and I mentioned this on the show last year. One of the things that Eisenhower did when he was president was I believe, he sent the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce Brown versus Board of Education, and you can get a whole different discussion about the whole civil rights movement. Whether the Supreme Court overstepped its boundaries, but that's another different conversation altogether. Um, I would say that Eisenhower definitely overstepped his boundaries by activating the U.S. Army to escort these black kids in this high school in Arkansas, because this was a clear usurpation of the Posse Comitatus Act. I've mentioned this to you before, Johnny, and to Eric, which came about in 1868, which specifically stated that the regular U.S. Military cannot be used domestically for law enforcement. Now, the courts over the years have interpreted that somewhat loosely. They said, well, does that apply to the National Guard? Does it apply to the Coast Guard when it comes to things like
Does that
drug
apply to Homeland
interdiction?
Security? I mean,
I'm sorry?
does that law apply to Homeland Security?
No, it does not, because they're under a different organization. Well, they're not military because they're federal law enforcement. So that's how they can get away with that.
It's
So,
amazing that they're not, like Forbes magazine covered this, I think, in 2014. Like the Department of Homeland Security ordered like 1 billion hollow point bullets. It's amazing how they can do that and not be considered a military. Like hollow point bullets are designed to go through bulletproof vests as well. Like that, to me, like that's almost like a declaration of war on the American people. They sorry, keep going, Rick.
okay, so I mentioned Little Rock, Arkansas. Well, a decade later, in 1967, there was a riot in Detroit, Michigan. And I mentioned this before, but just to refresh everyone's memory, the local cops couldn't handle it. So the mayor of Detroit, Jerome Kavanaugh, yes, he was Irish Roman Catholic, wanted Detroit mercy, asked the governor of Michigan if he could help out by sending in the National Guard, who at the time was George Romney, Mitt's dad. So he sent in the Army National Guard. They couldn't take care of it. So then Romney said to Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at the time, said, "Hey, Lyndon, can you help me out?" And he said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, "Sure, George, no problem." So he sent in, once again, he sent in the 101st Airborne to take care of a domestic situation in Detroit. Now, I'm not sure why he specifically sent the 101st Airborne, because maybe they're the only unit that was available.
Well, the next thing you'd look at, George, if you wanted to look deeper, the next thing you'd look at is who was in command, who was in the chain of command. Obviously, they had some of their own. They had some of their own involved.
Yeah. So I mean, does it the 101st? I mean, they're supposed to be parachutists. They're not. That's a whole nother conversation altogether. There's just like
Yeah, there might also have been some leftover prestige from World War One. Send in some World War One heroes to do a traitor's job, and this way, no one will question them.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I didn't look at the chain of command, and I probably should have, and I'll do that as soon as I can. So, at least twice in a decade, the 101st Airborne has engaged in treasonous behavior. They're sent in to do something that the local cops, or at least the state police, were supposed to do. And the situation was a little bit different in 1967 because most of the regular troops were over in Vietnam, fighting in the Papal Crusade over there. So I guess maybe the 101st was the only unit that was a spec in 1967.
Yeah. What? And let me also throw in real quick. I was going to mention this earlier with Eric talking about how many directors of the Defense Intelligence Agency have been Jesuit trained. I would say if you're coming across that and seeing actual military officers who are Jesuit trained, and it occurs frequently, shockingly frequently. It's very unusual because the typical military officer has a military education process that he goes through. So it's very unusual for that officer to leave the military education process in order to get that Jesuit education. What that means is it is really important for him to be on the Papist team. The current is it Dunford? Who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs right now?
Joseph Dunford.
Joseph Dunford, another perfect example. Good Irish Roman Catholic, Marine Corps general, traitor, oath-breaking piece of crap, who did time at, I think, Georgetown. Now, usually it's in the military, you have your own military colleges that you go to. But it's it just shows how all the more.
There's tons of it's actually overwhelming from what I found how many generals have gone to Jesuit schools. One here that I just found, this guy is a current Fox News military analyst, and he's his name's, I don't know if you guys seen Jack Keane, former American 4-star general, vice chief of staff of the U.S. Army, and he was the chairman of the board for the Institute for the Study of War, and he went to Fordham University, Jesuit Fordham. And as George, you're mentioning the 101st Airborne Division. Jack Keane, Jesuit trained at Fordham, was a commander of the 101st Airborne Division at one point, which is just interesting. It actually just mentioned, it mentions here that Keane saved the life of David Petraeus. Petraeus is another example of a high-level Army general trained by the Jesuits.
Saved his life.
Yeah, that's what, let me see what...
The only time I know of David Petraeus had his life in danger was when he took a 50 caliber round into his chest by accident. Some clown was loading a 50 caliber machine gun onto a deuce and a half, and it went off because it was never cleared, and it was an accidental negligent discharge. And that's the only time I ever know of Petraeus.
I think that's what was that in 1991. It says here that in 1991. Jack Keane saved the life of David Petraeus during a live fire exercise.
It wasn't an exercise. It was a negligent discharge. It wasn't even a live fire exercise. It was a negligent discharge. What a farce. What an absolute farce. By the way, hello to Geraldine, my dear friend in Ireland. I don't know if she's still listening. And that Roman Catholic priest who said that Satan is ruling in the Vatican, his name is Amorth, I think. Amorth, I'm pretty sure, something like that. Amorth, Father Amorth. Well, yeah, I'll look that up.
That was a very interesting revelation. I thought. Yeah, I think that was in a UK paper. I think that was the Telegraph. I know I got to get going to work shortly. Do you guys want to start wrapping things up?
Yeah, definitely. I got to get going too.
I'll start here. Just George had some interesting. I wanted to add on this, and actually. Before the name I wanted to mention, when we first started the show talking about like papists who have gotten involved in food chains. We were talking about Tim Horton, the Catholic who founded Tim Hortons. The name I was thinking of was Tom Monahan from Domino's Pizza. The Domino's Pizza founder, is a Knight of Malta, Opus Dei, and actually created this Catholic business foundation called Legatus, which is like you have to be a Catholic businessman making like over $5 million a year to join Legatus, for instance. But it's like kind of this like elitist financial. You kind of see what that organization, the Catholic financial aristocracy, wanted to mention that, and that's Thomas Monahan, and he was an advisor to Donald. He was an economic advisor to Donald Trump as well. But George, you're talking about Sirhan's lawyers going to Loyola. I thought that was just really interesting because if you could repeat the names of those, that'd be great. But okay. But just really quickly, I know the hotel that Robert Kennedy was shot at was owned by a Knight of Malta, I think David Shine or Michael Shine. His last name was Shine. But I think that the hotel being owned by a Knight of Malta just shows how the whole thing was controlled by the Vatican from start to finish.
Well, Mae Brussel, I'm not sure how awakened she was. However, she had made a number of videos, and she brought that fact up. She did not mention that Shine was of Knight of Malta, but she did mention that he was Jewish. And she made like a pause on one of her comments, like made like a pause.
Knight of Malta.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I think she did, at least on the show Knights of Malta Part 2. I think she did mention that Shine was a Knight of Malta.
Oh, okay, so I may have missed that, but I've only listened to a few of her shows, and they're like hundreds. She did hundreds, but one of the things Mae mentioned was this is in the 1970s. She was being honest. I'm not exactly sure who's running the world today. This is like 40 plus years ago, 45 years ago. However, whoever it is seems to like, and I say that I hate to say this as a Jewish woman, they love to hide behind Jews. But she made an interesting comment, regarding David Shine. The judge who heard Sirhan's case was named William Byrne, who was a professor at Loyola Marymount, an instructor or something like that. And his current lawyer is William Francis Pepper, whom I believe got his undergraduate degree from Boston College. Now, something I've mentioned before is Rome will usually be involved with a situation, oftentimes, at least in the periphery, such as they'll have somebody who's an adjunct instructor at one of their schools, is a lecturer, or they'll send their kids or something along those lines. So Rome was completely behind the Bobby Kennedy assassination. And if I could just mention something, this is just me, George, talking, and I'm just speculating. If you look at the four major U.S. assassinations of the 1960s, and there are others, the Kennedys, Jack and Bobby, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, Malcolm Little. I'm talking about the official story. I'm not talking about what actually happened. Okay. As we said, Robert F. Kennedy's assassin was officially Sirhan. Who actually killed him? Who knows? He was of a non-Catholic background. He was baptized Lebanese Orthodox, and he attended other churches. The alleged assassin of John F. Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, grew up Lutheran. So you had two Catholic figures who were officially killed by non-Catholics. In talking about Martin Luther King, his alleged assassin, James Earl Ray, grew up Roman Catholic. So King was supposed to be a Protestant, a Baptist minister, and he was officially killed by a Catholic. Now, I think one of the figures who ended up on the short end of the stick, but in more ways than one, was X. At least they didn't give him a courtesy of providing a patsy.
Yeah, well, George, I would say that's open a huge encyclopedia, and we should stop there before we go any further.
Great information there, George. I have to study the Malcolm X death incident more in detail, but I am aware that Malcolm X made an accusation that Louis Farrakhan was working for the KKK, and Farrakhan is a secret papist. He speaks at Catholic churches all the time. He bashes the Jews every chance he gets. And just one last thing before we go here. I mentioned the name of the Boston Globe reporter for the Globe during the Spotlight investigation being trained by the Jesuits. But I found his name here. It was Walter V. Robinson. He went to Boston College High School. And after Robinson also covered the White House for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush's presidencies. He was the Globe's Middle East bureau chief during the Persian Gulf War, just interestingly. but that was the guy's name, Walter V. Robinson. He was covering the Globe, covering the Spotlight scandal during the Globe. And I think possibly the reason they didn't, go hard on the Vatican was because they had, Jesuit-trained journalists doing the investigation. Just like, Philip Agee, the CIA investigator or whistleblower, like he gives out some good information. For instance, like Alfonso Michelson, the president of Colombia during 1965 to 1970, was an agent of the CIA. He doesn't say, though, that Michelson went to Jesuit Georgetown. But I think Agee is an example, probably like Walter Robinson, of kind of some watered down reporting. And Agee could have exposed, a lot more about the CIA than he did. And I think the fact that he was a Jesuit trained Roman Catholic altar boy from like a trust fund family is probably the reason. It's a reoccurring theme. Just really quickly, like the author John Loftus wrote a book. One of his first books was on Operation Paperclip in Belarusia in Eastern Europe, and he in that book said that the Vatican was like a willing dupe of Allen Dulles during Operation Paperclip. He's like Dulles manipulated the naive Vatican into using like their assets. But it turns out John Loftus went to Jesuit Boston College, and he's pushing this propaganda. So it is a reoccurring theme.
The huge Mother Jones article on the Catholic Intelligence Agency and the Roman connections does the same baloney psyop of flipping of the poor Vatican was manipulated by intelligence agencies. All the way around. All right, guys, solid show. I'll try to make myself available continuously in the future.
Oh, great! And actually, just one last thing, just kind of on the same wave. Just again, Boston College seems to come up for gatekeeper authors. Was Alan Ryan, who authored the Klaus Barbie report, who said, "Oh, the CIA had nothing to do with Klaus Barbie." Didn't even mention the Vatican once in the report. But Alan Ryan became a professor at Boston College after he whitewashed that report. But that's just a coincidence, though, right? I must be crazy for thinking that's significant.
Right.
Yeah, great show, guys. Thanks for coming on, and thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll probably do another one later in the week, for sure. I'll be free to do one.
Give me 20 lead time. I'll try.
Yeah, we'll connect via email, and maybe we can talk a bit about the huge drum on the next show and like the crazy U.S. taxpayer-funded envoy to ship Father Damien's the Apostle of Hawaii's remains to Belgium. Might be an interesting topic to go into more detail. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Peace and love, and take care.